In the 1930s, Europe stood on the edge of a storm it could not yet see, but could certainly feel. The scars of the First World War still ran deep economically, politically, and emotionally. Nations were rebuilding, but beneath the surface, resentment and anger simmered. And in this fragile moment, a single voice rose above all others. A voice that promised strength, revival, and destiny. It was the voice of a dictator whose ambition would soon plunge the world into the deadliest conflict in human history. Germany, devastated by the Treaty of Versailles, was desperate for hope. Factories were silent, unemployment soared, and inflation destroyed the dreams of thousands. People wanted someone who could restore pride, stability, and order. Adolf Hitler understood this desperation better than anyone. He used it like a weapon, shaping words into promises and hatred into a political engine. Through fiery speeches and relentless propaganda, he convinced a nation that he alone could lead them to greatness. But behind these promises lay a terrifying ideology, one built on racism, total control, and unrestrained militarism. The Nazi regime rapidly dismantled democracy, replacing it with fear. Opponents were silenced, minorities were targeted, and society was reshaped to obey the dictator without question. The world watched, uneasy but uncertain whether this rising threat would fade on its own, or explode into something far worse. Outside Germany, national leaders underestimated Hitler's ambition. Many believed he was simply a nationalist who wanted fair treatment for his country. Some dismissed him as a loud but harmless figure. Few realized that he was preparing for war, rearming the military, remaking the economy, and spreading propaganda across Europe. Meanwhile, the German people found themselves caught between hope and fear. Those who supported the dictator believed they were witnessing a rebirth of national power. Those who opposed him lived under constant threat from the Gestapo. But everyone, knowingly or unknowingly, was being pulled toward a future darker than anything the modern world had faced. By the late 1930s, the storm clouds gathered openly. The dictator had already broken treaties, annexed territories, and provoked neighbors. Europe trembled, knowing that another war seemed inevitable. But still, many hoped that diplomacy might stop the march toward destruction. They were wrong. The world was about to enter a chapter of fire, blood, and unimaginable cruelty, one that would end only when the dictator who started it faced the consequences of his own madness. And that end, though still years away, was already beginning to take shape. When Adolf Hitler secured full power in 1933, Germany changed overnight. What had once been a fragile democracy quickly transformed into a tightly controlled dictatorship, driven by fear, nationalism, and meticulously planned propaganda. The Nazi regime moved with ruthless efficiency, reshaping every corner of society from schools and newspapers to factories and courts, so that all served one purpose: to strengthen the dictator's vision of an all-powerful German Reich. The first blow fell on political opponents. Communists, Social Democrats, and anyone suspected of opposing Nazi rule were arrested, beaten, or driven into exile. The Reichstag fire became the perfect excuse for Hitler to demand emergency powers, allowing him to crush dissent in the name of national security. Within months, Germany had only one legal political party. The dictator's word had become law. Next came the media. Newspapers that criticized the government were shut down. Radio broadcasts were turned into tools of persuasion. Posters, slogans, and rallies filled the streets. Joseph Goebbels, the master of propaganda, ensured that every German woke up, worked, and slept under a constant stream of messaging designed to glorify the Führer and demonize those he considered enemies. Education followed. Children learned not to think freely, but to obey, to follow orders, and to celebrate the ideals of the Nazi state. Textbooks were rewritten. History was twisted. Science was corrupted with racist ideology. Boys trained for the military. Girls were taught to serve the nation by raising pure German families. The Hitler Youth became a gateway through which millions of children were shaped into loyal servants of the regime. But the darkest transformation targeted minorities: Jews, Roma, disabled people, and others were increasingly stripped of rights and dignity. Step by step, laws isolated them from society, banning them from schools, professions, and public life. Propaganda portrayed them as threats, fueling hatred that would soon explode into violence on an unimaginable scale. Beyond Germany's borders, the world watched with unease. Some leaders believed Hitler's rise was a temporary phase. Others feared challenging him would spark another war. And so the dictator continued to strengthen his grip, knowing full well that hesitation from other nations worked in his favor. By the mid-1930s, he felt unstoppable. Germany rearmed in defiance of treaties, rebuilt its military power, and prepared for expansion. The dictator believed he was destined to remake Europe territory by territory, nation by nation, but this path would lead to devastation. The seeds of destruction were already planted, and soon they would grow into the firestorm that would engulf the world. By the late 1930s, the dictator's ambitions could no longer be hidden behind speeches or political maneuvering. His rise had been swift, but now he sought something even greater: expansion. Germany, he claimed, needed living space, and he intended to take it by force if necessary. Europe watched anxiously as one bold move after another pushed the continent closer to the edge of war. The first major step came in 1936, when German troops marched into the Rhineland, an area that, by international agreement, was supposed to remain demilitarized. Many expected France or Britain to respond with force, but the Allies, exhausted by the memory of the First World War, chose negotiation instead of confrontation. Their silence gave the dictator confidence. He had tested the world, and the world had hesitated. 2 years later, he turned his attention to Austria. Through pressure, propaganda, and political manipulation, he orchestrated a takeover that looked bloodless on the surface, but was rooted in intimidation. In March 1938, German troops rolled into Vienna, greeted by cheering crowds and Nazi banners that filled the streets. Austria was absorbed into the Third Reich without a single shot fired. Next came Czechoslovakia, claiming that ethnic Germans living in the Sudetenland were being mistreated. The dictator demanded control of the region. European leaders met in Munich, desperately hoping to prevent war. They agreed to give him the territory in exchange for peace, an agreement now remembered as one of the most tragic failures of diplomacy. Within months, Hitler broke his promise and seized the rest of Czechoslovakia. Now it was clear the dictator could not be appeased. Each concession only encouraged him to take more. His armies grew stronger, his propaganda more aggressive, and his confidence more dangerous. The world sensed that something terrible was approaching, but no one could say when or how it would begin. Behind closed doors, Hitler planned his most daring move, yet an invasion of Poland. He believed that Britain and France would once again avoid war. To prepare, he signed a shocking agreement with the Soviet Union, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The two ideological enemies secretly agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. With the Soviet threat neutralized, the dictator felt unstoppable. Then, on September 1, 1939, German forces crossed the Polish border. Tanks thundered forward, aircraft roared overhead, and Europe's fragile peace collapsed instantly. Britain and France declared war 2 days later. The second great conflict in modern history had begun not with diplomacy, but with fire and steel. The dictator had unleashed a storm that would soon engulf the entire world. When the war began, the world was stunned by the sheer speed and ferocity of the German assault. This was not the slow, trench-filled struggle of the previous World War. This was something entirely new: Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, a strategy designed to overwhelm nations before they could even organize a defense. It combined fast-moving tanks, coordinated air attacks, and relentless infantry advances, all striking at once, like a hammer falling from the sky. Poland was the first to experience this terrifying new form of warfare. Villages burned, roads flooded with refugees, and cities shook under constant bombardment. The Polish army fought bravely, but they were outmatched and outmaneuvered. Within weeks, the country collapsed. divided between Germany and the Soviet Union as previously agreed in secret. Europe realized that the dictator's army was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined, but the storm had only begun. In the spring of 1940, Germany struck again, this time westward. Denmark and Norway fell with remarkable speed. Belgium and the Netherlands tried to resist, but were crushed by rapid, armored breakthroughs. The Maginot Line, France's pride and supposed shield, was bypassed entirely as German tanks cut through the Ardennes forest, a route military experts believed was impossible. Paris panicked. London watched in disbelief. The dictator's strategy was working with chilling precision. By June, France, one of Europe's strongest powers, was collapsing. The German advance seemed unstoppable. Millions fled south, creating chaotic rivers of people on the roads. The French government crumbled under the pressure, and soon, German troops marched triumphantly into Paris. Within 6 weeks, an entire nation had been conquered. Hitler was now at the height of his power. The world feared him. His enemies retreated before him. The map of Europe was transforming rapidly, with nearly every border bending to his will. Newspapers around the world reported the same chilling message. The dictator, who once seemed like a loud provocateur, had become the most formidable military force on the continent. Only one major country still stood between him and domination of Europe: Britain. But the dictator believed that Britain, isolated and shocked by France's fall, would soon surrender. He imagined a continent fully under his control, an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the edges of Russia. Yet he underestimated the resolve of those who refused to bow to tyranny. The war was far from over, and while Blitzkrieg had conquered nations quickly, it had also awakened a determination across the world, a realization that if the dictator was not stopped, no country would ever be safe. Ahead lay battles fiercer than anything seen so far. After the fall of France, Europe held its breath. The dictator stood triumphant, his army stretching across the continent. Only one nation remained unconquered: Britain, an island standing alone, isolated, but unbroken. Hitler believed the British spirit had been shattered. He expected negotiation, surrender, or at least silence. Instead, Britain prepared to fight with everything it had. To invade the island, Germany needed control of the skies, and so began one of the most defining air battles in history, the Battle of Britain. It was not fought on open land or stormy seas, but high above cities, farms, and coastlines. The Luftwaffe unleashed wave after wave of bombers and fighters, determined to destroy the Royal Air Force before Britain could recover. But the RAF stood firm. Pilots, some barely out of their teenage years, took to the skies in Hurricanes and Spitfires, facing overwhelming odds. They scrambled from airfields repeatedly, exhausted but resolute. Every mission meant life or death, yet they refused to yield. Their courage became legendary. Prime Minister Winston Churchill captured their spirit in words remembered forever. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. As the battle intensified, German bombers shifted their strategy. They began targeting London and other major cities, hoping to break the morale of the British people. Night after night, bombs rained down during what became known as the Blitz. Entire neighborhoods vanished in flames. Families huddled in underground shelters as sirens wailed across the night sky. Still, Britain endured. Despite the devastation, the British people refused to bow. Firefighters battled infernos in the streets. Civilians volunteered to rescue survivors from rubble. Children were evacuated to the countryside. Factories worked around the clock to replace fallen aircraft. The island, though battered, refused to fall. Meanwhile, the dictator grew impatient. His air force was losing more planes than it could afford. His timeline for invasion slipped further away. The RAF, though exhausted, remained intact, and every failure pushed the German high command closer to admitting the truth. By October 1940, the dictator made a decision he had never imagined. Just months earlier, he called off the invasion of Britain. It was his first major defeat of the war, and it shattered the myth of his invincibility. Britain had survived the storm, and though the war was far from over, this victory became a turning point, proof that the dictator could be stopped. that courage could overcome fear, and that freedom could stand against tyranny. But while Britain celebrated, a far more dangerous plan was already forming in Hitler's mind, one that would plunge the world into even deeper darkness. After the fall of France, Europe held its breath. The dictator stood triumphant, his army stretching across the continent. Only one nation remained unconquered: Britain, an island standing alone, isolated, but unbroken. Hitler believed the British spirit had been shattered. He expected negotiation, surrender, or at least silence. Instead, Britain prepared to fight with everything it had. To invade the island, Germany needed control of the skies. And so began one of the most defining air battles in history, the Battle of Britain. It was not fought on open land or stormy seas, but high above cities, farms, and coastlines. The Luftwaffe unleashed wave after wave of bombers and fighters, determined to destroy the Royal Air Force before Britain could recover. But the RAF stood firm. Pilots, some barely out of their teenage years, took to the skies in Hurricanes and Spitfires, facing overwhelming odds. They scrambled from airfields repeatedly, exhausted but resolute. Every mission meant life or death, yet they refused to yield. Their courage became legendary. Prime Minister Winston Churchill captured their spirit in words remembered forever. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. As the battle intensified, German bombers shifted their strategy. They began targeting London and other major cities, hoping to break the morale of the British people. Night after night, bombs rained down during what became known as the Blitz. Entire neighborhoods vanished in flames. Families huddled in underground shelters as sirens wailed across the night sky. Still, Britain endured. Despite the devastation, the British people refused to bow. Firefighters battled infernos in the streets. Civilians volunteered to rescue survivors from rubble. Children were evacuated to the countryside. Factories worked around the clock to replace fallen aircraft. The island, though battered, refused to fall. Meanwhile, the dictator grew impatient. His air force was losing more planes than it could afford. His timeline for invasion slipped further away. The RAF, though exhausted, remained intact, and every failure pushed the German high command closer to admitting the truth. By October 1940, the dictator made a decision he had never imagined. Just months earlier, he called off the invasion of Britain. It was his first major defeat of the war, and it shattered the myth of his invincibility. Britain had survived the storm, and though the war was far from over, this victory became a turning point, proof that the dictator could be stopped, that courage could overcome fear, and that freedom could stand against tyranny. But while Britain celebrated, a far more dangerous plan was already forming in Hitler's mind, one that would plunge the world into even deeper darkness. By 1944, the dictator's empire was cracking from every direction. The Soviets were pushing west with overwhelming force, reclaiming city after city. Allied bombers pounded German factories, bridges, and railways daily. But one decisive blow was still needed: an invasion of Western Europe. This operation would become known as D-Day, and it marked the beginning of the dictator's final collapse. The Allies prepared for months. Thousands of ships, aircraft, and soldiers gathered secretly in Britain. The goal was to land on the beaches of Normandy, break through German defenses, and establish a foothold on the continent. To mislead the dictator, an elaborate deception was created: fake armies, inflatable tanks, and false radio signals convinced him that the invasion would occur at Calais, not Normandy. On June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious assault in history began. In the early hours before dawn, Allied paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines, securing bridges and cutting communication routes. Soon after, thousands of landing craft headed toward the beaches. The sea was rough, the air thick with gunfire, and the stakes unimaginably high. At Omaha Beach, American forces faced devastating resistance. Machine gun fire tore through the air as soldiers fought desperately to climb cliffs and push inland. Bodies fell into the tide, but the survivors pressed on with relentless determination. British and Canadian forces stormed other beaches Gold, Juno, and Sword-breaking through fortified positions and establishing critical beachheads. The Germans, still convinced the main attack would come at Calais, hesitated. This delay proved fatal. By the end of the day, more than 150,000 Allied soldiers had landed in France. The dictator was furious. His belief in his own strategic brilliance shattered. The invasion he had dismissed as unlikely succeeded before he could react. Soon, Allied tanks and troops flooded deeper into France, liberating towns long trapped under oppression. 2 months later, Paris was freed. Crowds cheered as German forces retreated. For the first time since the war began, hope spread across a continent tormented by darkness. D-Day was more than a military victory, it was the symbolic beginning of the end. The dictator's empire was collapsing. His enemies were closing in, and he, once feared across the world, now found himself trapped by the very war he had unleashed. The final chapter of his downfall was approaching fast. June 6, 1944 D-Day marked the moment the dictator feared most. In the early hours before dawn, Allied ships, planes, and landing craft gathered off the coast of Normandy. It was the largest amphibious invasion in history. The goal: liberate Western Europe and bring the fight directly to the dictator's fortress. Under heavy fire, tens of thousands of soldiers stormed the beaches Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Waves crashed, bullets flew, and explosions tore the air. At Omaha Beach, the fighting was especially brutal. Many never made it ashore, but through sheer determination, the Allies established a foothold. By nightfall, more than 150,000 troops were ashore. The Atlantic Wall, the dictator's pride, had been breached. From that moment, Germany's collapse accelerated. Allied forces pushed inland, capturing towns and supply routes. French resistance fighters sabotaged rail lines and communications, disrupting German responses. In August, Paris rose in rebellion, and by the end of the month, the city was liberated. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front tightened like a vice. The Soviets launched massive offensives, driving German forces out of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics. Millions of German soldiers were dead, captured, or retreating. The dictator, furious and increasingly isolated, refused to accept reality. He dismissed strategic advice, fired experienced generals, and insisted on counterattacks that his army could no longer sustain. His once proud military machine had become a shadow of its former power. By late 1944, Germany was being squeezed from all sides. The Battle of the Bulge, a desperate German attempt to push back the Allies, failed. Supplies dwindled, fuel ran out, cities lay in ruins. The people no longer believed in the dictator's promises of victory. His speeches sounded hollow, his orders delusional. The end was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty. By the end of April 1945, Soviet troops were just streets away from the Reich Chancellery. The dictator, once feared across continents, now lived in the dim concrete corridors of a bunker deep underground. His empire had crumbled, his armies were defeated, and the people he claimed to lead were suffering the unimaginable consequences of his actions. Above him, Berlin burned. The city was an inferno, buildings collapsing, shells exploding, civilians fleeing through shattered streets. The noise of battle echoed through the bunker walls like constant thunder. There was no escape, no hope, only the final moments of a regime built on destruction. In his bunker meetings, the dictator still spoke of phantom divisions and miracle counterattacks, though none existed. His closest followers watched helplessly as he slipped further into delusion. Messages from the outside world brought only despair. The Soviets had reached the Brandenburg Gate. Allied forces were closing in from the west, and every major German city had fallen. On April 30, 1945, realizing the war was lost and unwilling to face accountability for his crimes, the dictator chose to end his life. In a small chamber beneath the earth, he made his final decision, a decision that reflected not courage, but cowardice. While millions suffered because of him, he refused to stand before the world he had devastated. Shortly after, Soviet soldiers reached the bunker complex. They found the remnants of a regime that had destroyed itself from within. Panicked officers, scattered documents, and a silence that marked the end of one of history's darkest chapters. With the dictator gone, Germany surrendered within days. Europe began the long journey toward rebuilding. The war had cost more than 70 million lives. Entire cities lay in ruins. Families had been torn apart, and the world carried scars that would never fully heal. But amid the devastation, hope returned. Nations united to rebuild peace. Survivors rebuilt their homes and their futures, and the world promised never to allow such hatred and tyranny to rise again. The dictator's end was not just the fall of one man, it was the collapse of an ideology built on fear, violence, and lies. His downfall marked the beginning of a new era, one in which humanity learned, through suffering, the importance of unity, justice, and freedom. His empire ended in fire, but the world emerged, determined never to let darkness rule again.